If you crashed into someone else's car, you'd expect to pay for it, right? Now imagine it was your home being destroyed, your livelihood, your community. The climate crisis threatens billions of people. But who should pay for it? And if they don't, who's going to make them? We're going to look at how some countries have contributed more to this crisis than others, how they can avoid paying for the damage they've caused, and how one man is trying to help change all that. Saul Luciano is a farmer from Peru. And here in the Andes is his home, where he lives in a small town called Huaraz. In 1941, a glacier lake above the town overflowed and created a flood thought to have killed 5,000 people. And today, 90 years on, Saul's afraid that another deadly flood could be coming.
Las temperaturas han subido y los nevados, las montañas que había glaciares están reduciéndose rápidamente.
When we talk about the climate emergency, this is it. The heating planet is melting the glacier above Saul's home, and he's decided to do something about it. In 2015, Saul began a process to sue a major Western fossil fuel corporation called RWE for damages. RWE is a German energy company, and Saul claims that its historic carbon emissions are one of the reasons his way of life is under threat. But the company doesn't even operate in Peru. RWE deny his claim that it, or any other individual for that matter, is responsible for the impacts of climate change. The case hasn't been heard in a court yet, so no judgment's been made, but it's the first of its kind in legal history. So why is it important that one person wants to sue one company for the impacts of climate change? Well, Saul's story is actually part of a much wider debate that's been going on between rich and poor countries for decades, because deciding who is actually responsible for climate change is complicated. But even more so is asking, who should pay for its consequences? Most simply, this is all about fairness and justice, and how the impacts of climate change aren't hemmed in by national borders. Yet most of the time when we're talking about the climate crisis and who's responsible and who can act to stop it, we're not talking about individuals like Saul, we are talking about countries. Because while our understanding of climate change might only be several decades old, the main things causing it, greenhouse gases, they've been pumped out by whole nation states for a lot longer. And actually, the story starts here in the UK, in the middle of the 18th century, when stolen resources from colonial projects around the world fueled the first industrial revolution. We're making a graph to explain how this story unfolded over time, and how different countries have had wildly different impacts on the climate. Each country is going to be represented by these cars, and they're going to move along according to their cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. That's the total amount their country has ever emitted, and it's going to help us understand their historic contribution to climate change. Even by 1800, the so-called spoils of empire and industrialization mean the UK has emitted way more than anyone else. But we're going to make the scale much bigger because we'll need more space for what happens next. At this much larger scale, it's hard to see, but early on, Britain and a handful of other countries like Germany and France were some of the only real emitters for a long time. It's not until the 20th century that the US joins the race, and its emissions start to grow rapidly, as it slowly, and then much less slowly, becomes the dominant political superpower. Then around the 1950s, you start to see China emerge. But even with its turbocharged growth from the 1990s to today, it's still a long way from catching the US. To date, China's produced about half the total amount of America. And then, right at the other end of the graph, is Saul's home country of Peru, which has actually emitted about 0.5% of what the US has. I guess the point is that climate change may be a borderless global problem, but countries' contributions to it are all very different, and some have driven it a lot more than others. Professor Ghosh, hello.
Hi, hello sir.
Hi. This is Professor Jayati Ghosh. She's one of the leading economists thinking about global inequality and what we can do about it.
There is of course a historical debt that rich countries got rich by extracting more of the global resources, reducing many of the people in the poor countries to poverty, and by basically exploiting the biosphere.
But when we look at annual emissions over the last 20 years rather than the historic totals, the situation gets a bit more complicated. For example, India is now the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, and China actually overtook the US as the biggest global emitter in 2005. But then, China's population is 4 times the size of the US, so if we divide annual emissions by the number of people in each country, we get per capita figures. And again, it's the US who's the biggest emitter.
Per capita emissions, per capita usage of basic nature is dramatically higher. across the north. Even the developing countries that are accused of becoming major polluters, like China and India, the per capita usage is one small fraction of what it is in the United States, for example.
So we're starting to see how historic responsibility for climate change isn't shared evenly across the world, but actually the effects of climate change aren't spread evenly either.
Mile upon mile of rural Zimbabwe is now without crops, without livestock, without water.
Initial estimates in the Bahamas talk of 13,000 homes damaged.
It's the rainy season, but in northern Ghana the rivers are running dry.
And this is kind of Saul's main point. He's a farmer in Peru, a country which has barely contributed any carbon emissions, and yet climate change might destroy his home. In fact, through a cruel twist of both history and geography, many of the poorest countries least responsible for climate change are the ones also dealing with its biggest impacts today, and also the ones with the least money to deal with it.
Is the lighting okay?
The lighting's correct. Farhana Yamin is an international lawyer, and she's been working with poor countries thinking about these issues for decades. We wanted to hear what she had to say despite the bad internet connection.
Those who are least responsible are actually suffering the greatest further losses that will fall on them. And so everyone recognises that's simply not fair. And those who are unable to pay, and absolutely when they didn't cause the problem in the first place, should not then be hit again. So I think even a 2-year-old will understand that that's unfair.
Okay, so actually we should be clear here, because these questions of fairness and who pays who, they've been tussled over between rich and poor countries for decades. Mostly at these annual summits run by the UNFCCC. That's the part of the UN that deals with climate change. And it's this that Yamin is referring to when she says enshrined legally.
The world is our garden, and together we must cultivate it.
Because as far back as 1992, at one of these UN summits in Rio de Janeiro, an agreement was made that rich countries would pay poor countries to help them fight climate change. So why are we even still talking about this?
A lot of the climate money that has been generated has gone to what we call mitigation, which is about reducing greenhouse gases. It doesn't help poor people who are on the front lines.
And this is where the conversation can get stuck. Money has been paid, but mostly to help countries lower their emissions tomorrow, but much less to adapt to the situation today. And despite some of the agreements already struck, rich countries haven't always lived up to their promises. One example of this was at the 2009 UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen, which was generally seen as a stalemate because no major new climate deal was reached.
What was earlier dubbed Copenhagen is now called Brokenhagen by green groups.
But rich countries did at least agree to pay poor countries $100 billion by 2020 to help them deal with climate change. And this is exactly the kind of fund that could have helped Saul protect his home from the glacier. And yet here we are in 2020 and still not all that money is materialised. Some research from 2017 put it around 70 billion, but suggests that the vast majority of that is used for emissions reductions, and only around 19% has gone to helping people adapt to climate change. Rich countries are still arguing over what form the money takes and where it goes, but the bottom line is that the poorest countries say they haven't received it. And this is where the story of Saul's court case becomes really relevant again, because we know which countries historically have emitted the most carbon that's driving climate change. And we have these UN processes where countries have agreed on that and said they'll act. But the gaps between words and action at the international level leave Saul with little choice but to find other ways of adapting. In other areas of law, and again if we think about this idea of fairness, it's normal to see compensation paid from one person to another where damage has been done. But in the halls of the UN, this part of the conversation has never got very far, and no rich country has yet made a payment because of, and the words we use here are important, its liability for climate change. This idea of so-called loss and damage payments has been resisted heavily by the US in particular. Is this fair for poor countries?
There are many ways to skin a cat, but in the end, that they are much more concerned with actual support arriving as opposed to whether it's called liability or insurance or financial assistance or something. It's like actually they just want support.
So does it really make sense to have a system which only deals with the symptoms of a problem and relies on rich countries voluntarily making payments to poor countries?
Too much of what is going on globally is always couched in terms of a gift from the north to the south. So, let's pay them a little bit and let's be nice to them. In fact, it's really how we are structuring international economic relations.
It's true that when it comes to the climate, a huge amount rests on these annual summits within the UNFCCC, where leaders slowly negotiate a position. But are they enough on their own? This is Richard Klein. He's a climate scientist who's been following these conversations for years.
There is a broader conversation about how the UNFCCC is in a way couched within a neoliberal framework that is basically kept intact, and whether or not effective climate action would really mean the dismantling of that neoliberal framework in which we operate. The short and easy answer is the UNFCCC is a climate treaty. It is not a treaty to create a new world order.
With access to UN funds and the fight against climate change so sparse, Sewell's legal battle against a major corporate polluter could be a game changer. It has the potential to set a legal precedent for others to be compensated in a similar way in the future. And it's already passed the biggest hurdle: getting a court to accept the argument that individual corporations can be liable for loss or damage from climate change, as long as its activities can be shown to have partly contributed to it.
Es una manera de hacer el reclamo, de decirle basta, no contamines.
But in the meantime, the ice is still melting. So where these questions of fairness and justice aren't answered, and where international agreements don't lead to action, individuals at the sharp edge of change will.